Hello and welcome to the special conversation with Dr. Timothy Bishop in Doordarshan. We have Dr. Timothy Bishop from University of Leeds, who has seen marriage between biology and mathematics, and he's an epidemiologist, genetic epidemiologist, and has really worked in a vast area of research. So, Dr. Timothy, welcome to Doordarshan.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the invite.
Yes. Dr. Timothy, I would like to ask you let us know our audience that what kind of work that you have done throughout the years. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you. Yes. So I trained as a mathematician. I did an undergraduate in mathematics, and mathematics has remained my main focus through all of my career. Although, as you say, I've worked in genetic epidemiology, which is more about statistics, and indeed have so I have worked on problems in genetics that have quite a mathematical basis, but have also been interested in broader aspects of biology.
Okay. But I would like to ask that lots of people have that fear of mathematics. They think what kind of mathematics would be useful in the later years. People think that generally the subtraction, addition, this kind of the basic functions are useful in daily life. But how had you used mathematics to understand the body, understand the nature, understand the genetic behavior inside the cells?
So many people think of mathematics simply in terms of the subjects that we learned at school, trigonometry, algebra, etc. But I prefer to think about it as a way of focusing our attention on factors in processes, so that the idea of mathematics is to essentially produce what we call a model of a scenario, which is to think about the aspects of a project that we know and aspects that we don't know, and essentially to write those down. So it's the discipline of writing down what you know and what you don't know about a problem. That is the training that I think is inherent from mathematics.
Correct. So, when it was the first time that you discovered that the knowledge of mathematics that you could apply in biological fields, so how did you started getting interested?
So my interest started when I was doing my PhD, and so my interest at that stage was in applying mathematics to biology. And I was posed a particular problem, which is an observation that was made many, many years ago, which was that in conflicts between animals, that they often adopt what is called a limited war approach, right? Which is that they, in competitions for resources which are scarce within a particular environment, they have to fight each other for those. And so, and what they do is to have a battle, right? But the battle, even though they have the ability to harm each other, they don't do that, right?
Yeah.
Essentially, they work out a way to decide who gets that resource without resorting to harmful violence, right? And so lots of people have thought about that and said that it's the epitome of animals behaving in a particular social way, in a particular group way. So they're doing things which are to the benefit of that group, right? And so the question was posed then, so what would happen if animals were doing things purely for their own good, right? So instead of worrying about everybody else, they worried about themselves, essentially, right? We're not actually thinking that they're worrying perhaps in the same sense as us, but could it be that their behavior is in some way influenced by essentially self-preservation. Right? And so what we did was to create a mathematical model. That is to think about the underlying issues, to write down some equations that described that, and said, okay, how would animals compete if they're simply worried about themselves? And what we showed was actually essentially the same thing would happen. So it's the benefit of the self as well as the benefit of the community. So the benefit that is good for the person is also good for the whole community in terms of not resorting to dangerous violence. And so for me, it was very useful training because it showed that you can build a mathematical model and you can work through, and after many months, see what the solution was, right? Which is very positive. But it also made me realize that actually it is both a kind of a strength and a weakness of mathematics, in the sense that now what we can say is that what is seen in biology, which is that animals compete in this non-violent way, right, is actually could come about if you postulated that they were doing things on behalf of the group, or if they were doing things on behalf of themselves. Right? And so what mathematics does is to say to you, okay, if this is true and this is true and this is true, then this is what likely will happen. Right? It isn't a way of saying, I have seen this, what is the cause of it? Because there are many different causes that could lead you to the same outcomes and perhaps the same observations. So it was a very useful training for me in terms of seeing the power of mathematics, but also the limitations of that kind of mathematical approach.
Okay. So, by this approach, do you really think that can you, as famously saying that by Mr. Richard Dawkins, that genes are selfish? So, can we conclude or can we hypothesize that genes basically are really selfish, that allow or they produce certain kind of behaviors to behave in a certain ways?
So what Dawkins did in that book, and in fact, he mentions the precise approach that I took in his book, The Selfish Gene. Right? And so what Dawkins does is to discuss, and I think actually show fairly effectively, right, that actually the concept behind the selfish gene is consistent with the observations, right? But none of the arguments, either the group theory or the selfish gene approach, proves the basis for it. They simply say that these assumptions could lead to the scenario, to the situations that we see. Right? So they don't prove anything. They don't prove that genes behave selfishly, but they just say the data are consistent with the selfish gene model.
Okay. When you must have looked after lots of data, lots of numbers, and associated behavior and observations for these many years. Do you really think that there could be any master equation, there could be any master understanding by which we can really predict individual as well as a group behavior in terms of gene expressions or gene behaviors?
I think those kinds of discussions are way ahead of where the field is, right? That we understand so little of what happens within a tissue, right? Remember that the experiments that we do, the observations that we make, are made at a single point in time. And often it involves taking the cells from their specific environment, from their specific tissue, and then processing them in some way. Right? So what we see is one point in time, right? And so we can do that many times, right? But once we've taken the cells out of their home tissue, then they're in a very different context, right? So we can take a different set of cells and repeat the same experiment, perhaps on the same organism later on. Right? And we can predict so little, we understand so little from the current approaches that it is impossible at this stage to speculate that we can go much further in terms of individual behavior. Tissues are one problem, but then tissues live among other tissues. They're exposed to so many different things at different times. We're learning so much about, for the majority of my research career, we've had no concept of the biome, right? And all of a sudden we realize that the biome is hugely influential on our behavior. People talk now about the biome and response to therapy for cancer, right? Which was something we didn't speak of 10 years ago. So things are changing so much and so rapidly, but at the moment we can predict very little.
So you are interested, or you have also studied the genetic variance in general population.
Yeah.
So what kind of understanding that you got through this as a human species, as a Homo sapiens, how unique we are, how different we are from each other, and what connects us and what might disconnect us?
Yes. So I have spent my career in genetics, as you say, because it is quite mathematical, right? And the usual way that we start our genetics lectures at the very beginning of genetics careers is that we say that if we looked at everybody in the world's DNA, the basic building blocks of us, then what we'd see is we laid it out and looked at the similarities and differences, we'd see that we were, I don't know what the current figure is, but kind of 97 or 98% the same. Right? So our DNA is very similar, right? But at the same time, we know that there is individual variation in there that differs between each of us, right? And we know that particular genes have particular effects on particular traits, right? So it's at the moment a quite, it's a clear knowledge that some genes in particular have associated with a high risk of a particular disease. Right? Many genes have a more modest effect, so they perhaps influence a little to do with our height, our weight, our skin color. Right? But these are all things that are, that they contribute to. They don't define us entirely, and so there is the way that we behave, the way that we interact with our environment also has an effect. So genes bring us together. I mean, as a geneticist, I'm always, it is wonderful to see how similar we all are to each other, but how little variations make differences, and it's very interesting to see. I've been fascinated to see how that information has evolved over my career.
Correct. You also studied the non-genetic factors also, like so kind of social and economic diversity we have, the kind of impacts that we see in climatic conditions, and lots of other things are going on, like the invasion of technology this much in this time. So how do you see how these non-genetic factors are really impacting us as a species?
I realize as soon as I start discussing non-genetic factors that actually genetic factors seem a whole lot more simple than those. That may or may not be true, but it is so difficult to discuss non-genetic factors. Take a simple example, right, which is I've spent a lot of my career thinking about sun exposure and risk of skin cancer, because especially in the West, the rates of skin cancer are going up dramatically, right? And we believe that it's because of and the evidence suggests that it's because of our changing behavior in the sun, right? We spend more time in the sun, and that we're more exposed than we used to be to the sun, and that's leading to changes in the rates of skin cancer. And some of these skin cancers are very serious, life-threatening illnesses. And when you ask me to talk about what aspect of the sun exposure it is that's important, I can't tell you, right? Because it is so difficult to quantify what is meant by sun exposure. No. Is it the maximum exposure you have in a time, or the average exposure, or the way that you have exposures? I mean, I've long thought that maybe it's about, the risk is about being exposed to lots of sun when you've had a winter where you haven't seen much sun. That it's a change. It's that kind of change that's important. And after many thousands of hours thinking about this and doing research on this and looking at other people's research on this, I can't tell you, right? So if in a supposedly simple example, you can't come up with you can't say what the answer is, then it's difficult to think about more complex examples, right? So I think it is a very particular challenge, and one that I think is something that we really need to think about. As you say, so much is changing. Climate to have an impact, but then social trends that have a major impact as well. Coco Chanel in the 1930s, defined particular styles of women's clothing, and that's supposed to have had large effects. Other large effects happen subsequently, so it's very difficult to define them with any great precision. So in that case, genetics seems much simpler.
Yeah. As a young mathematician, you must have made some predictions. So in this stage of life, do you really, if you look back at your predictions in your mind, in the papers, in the researches, do you really think that with the help of maths, you might have been very much confident about a few results as a mathematician, because it can predict things? So how many of them, how many, not in quantitative way, but in qualitative way, were they true, were they near the truth, or something that whatever you predicted you feel is right, or something that you felt, oh, it really surprised me, it brings out a new dimension to look at?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that latter aspect is what's happened, that that over the years in research. So I have spent most years working within a cancer research institute, right, and thinking about issues related to the treatment of cancer, and even in that limited field. So I would never have predicted I was getting into cancer treatment as a young mathematician, right? But it happened, right? And now I look at cancer treatments, and they have changed so much that in the 70s it was the finding of cisplatin, which we thought was all going to solve so many treatment problems, right? And then the immune system became a favorite in the 80s, right? And by the 90s it was much less favored, and yet by 2010s the immune system seems to be the heart of all of the major new treatments for cancer. So things that you predict and then realize they're wrong come back again, and some disappear. So I think I'm not the kind of person who thinks a lot about the far future, and I didn't make many predictions, but I think if I had made any, they would have been entirely wrong, because so much of knowledge has changed over time, and so much and new things come to light that one really didn't expect. I mentioned the biome a few minutes ago, and that's a whole new field, and recognition about the importance of the biome is continually astounding now. I mentioned about mathematics and its importance. I think that mathematics has been very important to me, and there are particular scenarios where it has made major contributions to our research. Right? So one of them involves in the middle of the 1980s, we were just being able to begin looking at genetic variation in humans. And the idea was, so this wasn't at the stage where the Human Gene Project had started, or wasn't even particularly contemplated at that stage, but it was recognized that we needed to do something like essentially sequence all humans, or sequence a large number of humans. And the question was, how would you do it? Right? And so at that stage, we knew about the ways in which we could look at DNA. We knew some things about DNA, like how, essentially how many DNA bases there, because you can get that information other ways. But we didn't know what process we would have to go through to be able to get to a stage to be able to do the Human Gene Project. And so that from getting from where we were to being able to do the sequencing required construction of maps, because you require the maps to work out, you put the maps together because the maps tell you how you get from one place to another place, in this case along the human chromosomes. Right? And so in that case I could define the approaches, I could define what we knew, I could define what we didn't know. Right? And so I could then think about writing that mathematically, which we could do. And with that, we could define the different types of approaches that we could take. And it suggested one particular approach was perhaps better than the others. And that was the one that we followed. And it led, in the end, to the being in a position to go on to be able to do the sequencing of all chromosomes. So there was an example of where mathematics worked perfectly, where you could define the project, it was well defined, you knew what you knew what you didn't know, and so you could look at this in terms of what difference do these unknowns make, and come up with a prediction of the best approach. And it turned out there was one approach that was better than the others, and that was the one that was overall followed. So, and I think when we talk in terms of mathematics, we tend to talk in terms of algebra, etc. Often, actually, now when we think about it, we're talking about computer, writing computer code to simulate the particular processes, because they may not be the equations may not be commensurate with solving them analytically. So one resorts to computer simulations, and that is really where we've ended up a lot of the time. But so in very particular scenarios, this kind of mathematical approach has worked very well.
Correct. Professor, sometimes when we start measuring things, we or calculating things, we really pick up some units. But when we start measuring something, a larger thing or a very smaller thing, we also miss out the other details that which we are not measuring.
Yeah.
So whatever we are seeing or looking at, that only becomes a part of the reality in the part of the calculation. Then what about the things that we have missed? We might have missed, and that error might accumulate in later stage also. So how do we handle this? How do we look into totality while also measuring a very smaller or other quantities or dimensions.
So this is a kind of general area that statisticians call extrapolation, right? And statisticians would say to you that you can't extrapolate beyond the data that you have, right? So in other words, you know that if you increase something, then something else happens, right? Yeah. And in the end, you have enough data, you can say, well, actually, in future, I can predict what will happen. If I double the amount of this, what will happen to this? So that's a prediction, right? But if you predict beyond the scope of the data that you have, right, then you can't expect that prediction process to be perfect, and often it will be way off. And that's true in the kind of example that you're talking about as well, which is that our mathematical model is appropriate in the defined context and in the defined situation that we develop it in. That if we go beyond that, as could happen if external factors influence the whole object that we're looking at, then we can't really expect it. So mathematics can tell us a little bit about the components that we're focusing on, but not about the whole engine.
Okay. So we might also miss out lots of things, and we might come up with something that might not be true.
Absolutely. Yeah. So and in fact, in many ways, that's the most interesting scenario in mathematics, it seems to me, that we develop a mathematical model, we look at the impact of that mathematical model, right, and we look at the predictions it makes, right? And I know, as I said earlier on, that what we have to understand is just because our model predicts that doesn't mean that that's the truth, right? So that actually the most interesting scenario is often when your model predicts something that isn't true, right? Because that tells you that there's something wrong with your assumptions. There's something more complicated than you have expected, right? And so that's, as I say, that's often the most interesting scenario, because it tells you have to go and look and think about what it is that you think you know, or what it is that could be changing over time, say. But those have been some of the most interesting experiences of all.
Correct. And lastly, that I would like to ask that we are sitting and talking in India, and India has a very great contribution in the world mathematics. So how do we see the role of India in developing the basic understanding of mathematics, and how do you see Indians are also contributing to the sector that you're working?
So Indians are people from India, and Indians are making already major contributions. I mean, I know the field of bioinformatics and genetics more than most, and some aspects of mathematics. And so we see many who are coming through and are well trained, in terms of undergraduate degrees or schooling, who have the mathematical skills, the mathematical resources, the understanding of the mathematical approach that is invaluable in terms of especially things like bioinformatics. Right? So I'm not saying that that's the limit. That's a limitation. I'm just saying that that's the area I've seen, and that's the area where I've seen particular contributions. And it's true that we see many students coming through now. We've had a number of Indian students within our laboratory in Leeds who've come through from excellent Indian training to go on to now make very successful careers in genetics, science, biotechnology, bioinformatics. So there's clear an area, and of course there's a very long history of mathematical contributions from India in statistics and mathematics, and may it continue.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Team, to talking to Doordarshan, and thank you for giving this wonderful insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.